There is a really great Shakespeare quote that says, "Hell is empty because all of the devils are here." And I thought that that was very appropriate to preface today's case, because our story is about a guy who is just plain evil. And I went down a bit of a philosophical rabbit hole of sorts, because it really got me wondering, like, what is evil? And anybody of faith can tell me all about the devil and God. And sociologically speaking, we can describe evil as something morally reprehensible. But in my opinion, that's very subjective, because what I might find morally reprehensible, you might not. And the law might not. You can go out and cheat on your spouse till the cows come home, and you're not going to do a day's jail time for it, because morality and criminality are not the same thing. Now, there are a list of things that are deemed to be so morally reprehensible and so socially unacceptable that yes, they are criminalised. And if you engage in any of these, you will be punished. You will have your freedom taken away from you. You will be fined, or absolute worst case scenario, you will be sentenced to death. But does that mean that every criminal is evil? No, I don't feel like that is a fair characterization either. When I think of evil, I think of the worst monsters, the most heinous crimes that you can imagine inflicting on another human being. But are these people evil, or can it all be explained away by psychiatry? We always have to find the why, don't we? As humans, it's something that we need. Whenever we get to the end of one of these true crime stories, there's two things that we need to see happen. We need to see justice done. We need to see the culprit brought to justice for the crimes they've committed. And we need to understand the why, the motive. Why is it that they did this horrible thing? And it got me thinking about how we comfort ourselves when we listen to true crime, when we read about true crime, even when we watch horror movies. I feel like sometimes horror movies are the most unsettling when there is no explanation, there is no why. It's why Michael Myers was such a haunting character, because there was just no explanation as to why he was so evil. He just was. And when we talk about these monsters every week, we can often look to their childhood and we can see there was abuse, trauma, poverty, sexual exploitation, or exposure to all of the above. And we can say, well, that's what made them the way they are. That's why they went on to do those horrible things that they did. And then in other cases, like for example, Joel Michael Jr., we talked about him. He had a pretty blessed life. He had a lovely upbringing. He was in a family that would have done anything for him. And he turned out to be a monster. But we were still able to point to something and say, well, he was greedy, he was lazy, he didn't want a job, he wanted money, and that's why he did those evil things that he did. And today's story is one that doesn't really have a why. I mean, you can explain it away with psychiatry, but is it simply psychiatry, or are some people just plain evil? So, before we get into it, welcome back to The Criminal Spud, where we explore some true crime in a short, informal way. Some of the content may be upsetting, and today is especially graphic, so if you're not in the headspace or it's just not your jam, that is absolutely fine. Go ahead and press skip. But on the other hand, if you do enjoy this kind of content, please let me know by liking and subscribing. And without further ado, this is the case of Karol Kot. So we are going back in time a minute. We are going back 60 years, in fact, to the year where Mary Poppins and My Fair Lady have just hit the silver screen. Roy Orbison is singing Pretty Woman, which it's so strange to think that that song was around before Julia Roberts was even born, let alone hooking on a street corner. And the Supremes were singing Baby Love, one of my favourite songs of all time. So it is 1964 and we are in Krakow, Poland. And Karol is this 17-year-old boy. He's still in school. He's still a child for all intents and purposes. And he's had a pretty regular, average upbringing with regards to family. So he's got his mum and his dad. His mum is a stay-at-home mum and his dad is an engineer. So he's got a really good job. They're not short of money. There's no kind of abuse in the home, no domestic violence, no, even raised voices. He doesn't have some bully at school making his life hell. By all appearances, his life was pretty cookie cutter. But then when he was 8, his little sister came into the picture and Karol was not happy about this. He was used to being an only child. He was used to having his mother's undivided attention. And anyone who has siblings can probably attest to the fact that there's often a little bit of rivalry, a little bit of jealousy. You might even get into some fisticuffs with your sibling at some point in your childhood. I don't think that that is unusual, but Karol was very cruel to his little sister. It wasn't just that he was jealous, it's that he was a bully. He would push her around as she started to grow up. He never really took to her. He had no interest in playing with her, but it was more than that. He kind of felt like his parents were, forgetting about him. They were leaving him behind. And he was going to take all of this anger out on his little sister. And not just his little sister, they had 2 cats. They had like family pets. And he started to take it out on the cats as well. He would be really rough with the cats. He would be really cruel with them. He would hide their food bowls. He would coax them over like as if he was going to pat them or, play with them. And then he would rip clumps of their fur out like for no reason. And there was also an occasion where he picked up one of the cats and flung it at a wall. Now, we're not talking about a toddler. We know toddlers can sometimes be a little rough with the family pets. But this is like between the ages of 8 and 10 at this stage, he is. So he's picking up a living animal and throwing it at a wall. Like, not good. And the hostility and violence was also being directed towards the little sister, albeit in smaller doses, because he kind of knew at this stage that he could probably not get away with picking his sister up and throwing her against a wall the same way he could with a cat. But this cruel streak in him is the beginning, shall we say. And then at around age 11, so they're a family of 4 at this stage, and they start going away on these family vacations just down to the countryside. And there's a little cottage that they go to, and it's in this really idyllic kind of rural area, and there's just farmland around as far as the eye can see. And not too far away from this little cottage is this pig farm, and there's a slaughterhouse attached to it. And the first time that they're going down to this cottage, the parents stop off there with their 2 little kids. And I mean, kids go to farms all the time on their school tours. I don't recall ever being brought to a slaughterhouse. I think that would have been pretty traumatizing. But look, there are kids out there who grow up on farms and they see this kind of stuff. It's normal. It's educational. So the parents bring Karol and his little sister to this pig farm and slaughterhouse just to show them around, kind of give them a new experience. And Karol he's obsessed. He thinks this is the coolest thing ever. And the parents, they're excited to see that he's so interested. He finds this to be an engaging activity. So of course, they don't see this as concerning. It's educational. The farmer is bringing them through the entire process, how it comes to be an animal in the field to food on your plate, and they get to see how the animals are killed. They get to see how they're hung up and bled out. And yeah, it wouldn't be my cup of tea. I don't think as a child I would have enjoyed that whatsoever, but to each their own. And look, the parents go home after this whole farm and slaughterhouse tour, visit, whatever you want to call it. And Karol is he's on cloud 9. He's had the best day ever. So of course they're delighted, but they have no idea what has just been awoken within their child, because Karol has just realized that he thinks blood is awesome. He wants to see more blood. It has nothing to do with the animals being killed. He can take it or leave it with the death part, but it's the bleeding part that has touched him. He has felt this insane rush of excitement and pleasure. He wants to reach out and touch it, feel if it's still warm. He wants to feel it on his hands. He wants to feel it on him. He needs to experience that again. And he is just lying in his bed, replaying this day over and over in his mind. And it makes such a lasting impression on him that the family, they actually return to this cottage many times for many different family vacations. And the next time they go down to this cottage, the first thing Karol wants to know is, do we get to go and do another tour of this slaughterhouse? I want to go back there. So the parents are like, well, of course, it's great. You really liked it. Of course, we'll do it again. And they bring him back. And there's these 2 farmers that are kind of working away. They're bleeding out some animals. And they invite Karol in to, observe, maybe give a hand. And they're not used to kids being so willing. Usually they get kids coming in with their families or on school tours and being slightly squeamish. And the younger farmer, he kind of wants to see how far he can push this. He kind of wants to have a little bit of a practical joke, if you like. He's winding up Karol. And he says, well, you're one of us now, the only last part of the initiation, you have to drink. And he like scoops this little cup of the pig's blood and hands it to Karol. And you see this with any of, like the London Dungeons or the Viking Splash or anything. They want to gross you out. They want to get a reaction. So they're probably expecting this 12-year-old boy to like recoil in horror and for the blood to drain from his face or him to kind of start dry heaving. And it's just to have a little bit of a laugh. It's a practical joke. And it's a wind-up, but no, before they've even had a chance to finish the sentence or the pitch, Karol has snatched this cup and he has gulped it down. It is still warm from this pig and they are horrified. The parents are horrified. The farmers' faces are like, what the fuck? Like we were joking. And as you can imagine, this is the end of their visit and it is the last time that the parents ever go back to this slaughterhouse with Karol. Now, they don't bring him to a doctor or a psychiatrist at this point. They don't think that there's any cause for concern. They just think that he took a practical joke way too seriously and it was disgusting and they're going to avoid that in the future. But they don't actually think any more of it. Now, Karol, on the other hand, he now has a taste for blood and he has decided that this is definitely something that he's going to need to have again. And this doesn't go away. This continues and it gets stronger each year that passes. So Karol is going now into his teenage years and he's starting to collect knives. Knowing what we know, very unsettling, but his parents, they don't see anything sinister with this. They just see it as a hobby. He collects these knives. A lot of them are antique, like very old knives. He's gotten some of them from antique stores. He's bought them from his pocket money. He's not trying to hide the fact that he's collecting them, nor to their knowledge is he bringing them outside of the house. So they don't have any issues with him collecting the knives at this point. But what the parents don't know is that he actually is bringing them outside of the house. He's bringing knives out into these fields that are nearby the house and he's finding wild animals or just house pets that have gone on a little stroll and he's capturing them, he's stabbing them and he's consuming their blood. And this goes on throughout his teenage years all the way up to about age 17 when he realizes that the animals, they're not really cutting the mustard anymore. He needs something bigger. He needs to start progressing to humans. And he's got his first kind of love interest around this time. There's a girl called Danusha. And he seems to be obsessed with Danusha. He thinks Danusha is his girlfriend. Now, whether or not Danusha shares that sentiment is up for debate. She kind of sees him more like a friend. But anyway, him and Danusha are out one day and he tells her everything. And I mean everything. The animals, the wanting to progress to a human, wanting to see blood coming out of a human body, to feel the blood on him, to taste the blood. And Danusha just thinks that he's gone crazy. Like she doesn't take this seriously at all. And then he takes out this glass shard from his pocket and he kind of muses out loud that, I could cut your throat right now, or maybe I could cut your wrists and I could leave you in the river and people would just think it was a suicide. And Danusha just kind of laughs in his face and says, yeah, great idea, Einstein. Like, it's not as if people will put two and two together. They all know that we're out hanging out together and then I just show up mysteriously dead. Like, that's not going to raise alarm. And it's crazy because she laughs this off and completely dismisses it, whereas he was actually fully intending to harm her, to do this. And I think her reaction nearly slapped him back to reality and he just decided, it's not worth it. And I think he also realized that she wasn't afraid of him. She was laughing in his face at the prospect of him attacking her. And I think it made him realize that if he is going to harm a human, it had better be a human that's more defenseless than Danusha, someone that he could probably overpower a little bit more easily. And Danusha was so unaware of the danger that she was in. Like, she genuinely thought that this was just him talking crazy. Like, he didn't mean any harm. They continued their friendship. They still maintained a friendship after this. Like, she didn't feel threatened by him whatsoever. It was just Karol being a weirdo. But unfortunately, as weird as he might have come across, he was very serious. And in February of 1964, he attacked his first human victim. So like I said, it's February. It's absolutely freezing. He is bundled up warm. He's got this bayonet knife that he's brought out with him from his collection. And he's got that concealed in his jacket. And he's just looking for anybody. He's looking for somebody who's vulnerable, someone who's going to be easily overpowered. So he figures probably someone more elderly and someone who's by themselves. And he kind of walks the streets for a little while at first, but it's fruitless. And then he's passing this church and he thinks, bingo, I will go in, I will sit in this church. It's a little bit warmer at least. And it's very quiet. There's not many people around and someone might come in. It's completely empty at this point. So he goes in and he sits in one of the church pews and he just waits. And he sits there for over an hour. And just as he's about to get up and leave and go home for the evening, a 48-year-old woman called Helen comes in. And she kind of quietly shuffles up the aisle and she slides into one of the church pews just ahead of where Karol is sitting. And that's it. He knows this is his first victim. She's alone. There are no witnesses around. She's got her back to me. Could not be more perfect. So he kind of takes out his bayonet knife and as stealthily as he can, he kind of slides out of the pew, makes his way up to the one behind Helen. And he comes up behind her and he takes his bayonet knife and he drives it down into her back. And Helen is stunned and she shouts out in pain and her shouts echo throughout this entire empty church, this big cavernous tall ceiling, like you can only imagine whenever someone sneezes in a church. But she screams out and Karol has already run out the front door. So she's just there by herself in this church. And she doesn't realise that this guy has stabbed her because it happened so quickly. And she just thinks that this nutcase came up and punched her in the back. She doesn't actually realise that there was a knife. She just feels pain. And it's only when she gets up and she leaves and walks outside, someone comes up to her and says, "Oh my God, you're bleeding. Your back is covered in blood." And it's then that the shock kind of wears off and she realises that this person didn't come up and punch her. This person came up with a knife and stabbed her. So she goes to the hospital and gets medical attention and thankfully Helen is okay. She recovers from this and she has no idea who this perpetrator was. So she reports it to the police, but I mean, they've no way to find this person. She didn't even get a good look at him when she was coming into the church. Why would she? But only 2 days later, Karol is ready for his next fix and he is back out there and he's walking the streets. He's got his bayonet knife on him concealed and he spots Francesca. So Francesca is an elderly lady. She's getting off this tram and she's walking up the steps of her building and he makes a beeline over towards Francesca and he comes up behind her on the steps and exactly the same as with Helen, he just completely stuns her. He takes her by surprise. He drives this knife, this bayonet knife down into her back, rips it back out just as quickly and he runs away into the night and leaves Francesca sitting there on the steps bleeding. And passers-by can hear her cries and they're able to find her and call for an ambulance and get her to the hospital. And she does survive, but there's a lot of nerve damage where Karol had stabbed her in the back and it impedes her ability to walk for the rest of her life, which is just horrific. Like there is no rhyme or reason for this. Karol, he's not intending to kill these people. He doesn't care whether they live or whether they die. Karol is doing this so that he can go home or to his private place or wherever the hell it is that he runs to after. And he wants to observe this bayonet knife. He wants to see the blood on the blade. He wants to run his fingers down the blade and feel the blood between his fingers. And then, it's disgusting, I can't believe I'm saying this, he wants to lick the blood from the knife until the knife is clean. So yeah, his intention is not necessarily to murder, but it's to taste human blood. And this need seems to be very overpowering because he doesn't even wait a week until he goes out again and he finds his third victim. And this time it is an 86-year-old woman. Her name is Maria and he accosts her as she's going into a convent. And again, the same exact story. He comes up behind her, he takes her by surprise and he drives this bayonet knife down into Maria's back. And they can tell from the depth of the stab wound that he's growing in confidence. He's becoming much more vicious in his, attack. And he makes away, and Maria is found by a nun who's come out. She can hear screaming, and Maria is bleeding out on the floor. Her heart has kind of been ruptured from the back, and she's able to tell the nun it was a young boy, but that's all that she can really get out before she passes away, because this wound that Karol has inflicted, it was devastating, it was fatal, and Maria does not survive this. She dies right there at the scene. So Karol has claimed his first human life, and fear is rife across Krakow. So this is all over the papers. It's all anybody can talk about. So there's been 3 knife attacks, one of which has resulted in death, and 2 of these have taken place at a church or a place of worship. So you can only imagine what people are saying, what kind of theories are being floated. And Karol at this point, he kind of says, okay, I'm going to take a little bit of a break from this. I'm going to sit back. He's really enjoying the coverage of it, mind you. He's really enjoying the fear that this has all caused. And it's almost enough to sustain him for now. And he starts to brainstorm, what other ways could I cause terror? Like maybe I can just take a lot of lives, and that will give me the same kind of pleasure and satisfaction as tasting their blood will give me. And, it'll give me a chance to lay low while the cops are looking for some young boy stabbing people. So Karol decides poisoning it shall be, and he gets a hold of this sodium arsenate. And he goes to a couple of local pubs, bars, even a restaurant. And wherever there is a random kind of drink, like a half bottle of beer or a half pint just left unattended, he kind of spikes these drinks with this sodium arsenate, hoping that someone will come along and just pick up this random half drink and knock it back, and it will kill them. But it doesn't really go as planned, because obviously if you're finding an abandoned half drink, that person has probably left. They've probably left it behind. And not many people, when they're in a pub or in a restaurant, just go up and take a half drunk bottle or a glass of something and start consuming it. So yeah, this plan doesn't really bear any fruit for him. He doesn't take any lives, thank God. So he kind of goes back to the drawing board and he says, what about arson? He's literally just thinking of ways that he can damage people. And this is why I'm wondering, is this a case of just evil? Psychiatry aside, is this just evil? But anyway, so he decides arson it shall be. And he starts attempting some small fires, at houses, at factories, places where it will go up in flames and claim a bunch of lives. And he's just getting rags and covering them in accelerant and setting them alight and running away. But he doesn't have a clue what he's doing, and they're not having the desired effect. Like, they're not going up in flames, they're just kind of burning out or smoking a bit. So yeah, look, arson is obviously not his path in life. And he toys around with these different methods of destruction for about 2 years, right up until February of 1966, when he realises, listen, none of this is cutting the mustard. None of this satisfies me the way that blood satisfies me. And I need to get back to doing what I do best, which is sneaking up behind vulnerable people and stabbing them and consuming their blood. So that's exactly what he does. The only difference this time is that he's not going to target elderly women. He's got his sights set on children. So it is February of 1966. It is super snowy. Everywhere just looks like this white glistening wonderland. And Karol is 19 at the time, so he's still actually in school. He's in his final year and he's going to be doing his final exams shortly. And he goes out into the snow and he kind of walks around, drifts around, looking for where there might be children, because where there might be children, he might find some stragglers who have strayed from the main pack. And he finds this group of kids, small kids, like sledding on this hill. It's, like I said, it's a winter wonderland. They're having the best time ever. They're just dragging their little sleds up to the top of this hill and racing back down and racing each other and laughing and having the best fun ever. So Karol is just kind of lurking not too far away, just on the other side of the hill, in where the trees are. And he gets his opportunity because it doesn't take long and he hears these little feet crunching along in the snow. It's this 11-year-old boy called Lasek, and he's dragging the sled behind him. He's obviously late for all of the fun. and he's making a beeline over to where all these kids are racing. And Karol does not miss this opportunity. He strikes like a viper and he grabs Lisek and he pulls out this bayonet knife and he drives it down into Lisek and stabs him 11 times. What an escalation. Like, not just the one stab and run. This is a brutal, sustained attack. This is overkill. It's like he's this animal who's been caged for 2 years and now he's finally out there satisfying his lust for blood. And you can only imagine how much blood there was. It was probably all over Karol, and I'd say he loved every minute of it. And he flees the scene, obviously, with his bloody hands and knife and clothes to go home and do God knows what. And he just leaves Lisek's lifeless little 11-year-old body there, just laid out on this white snow, covered in blood, for God knows who to find. Like, I can't imagine. It didn't say who found Lisek, but all I can think of is there's these children, they're sledding, they're all out having the time of their life in the snow. So yeah, I hope and pray that it wasn't one of the other little kids that actually came across this horrific scene. But Karol, meanwhile, just, a little tidbit here, later on that evening when Karol was cleaned up and finished doing whatever I don't want to imagine him doing, he went out and got himself some cake at like this local bakery because, I don't know, maybe he worked up an appetite, maybe he just felt like he needed some cake. Like, that's how little remorse, how there was no pause at all. He has no fucks to give. But this violent, brutal attack on Lisek, it sustained him for about 2 months because he waited 2 months until he went out hunting yet again. And this time he found like an apartment block, more so in the city centre. So he's getting more ballsy with where he's going to find people, and he's looking for little kids. So I imagine it wasn't in the dark of night because he needs to find a child alone. So it's probably the daytime when this happens. And he finds like this big, tall apartment building, and it's got like this zigzag stairs coming down the side, level to level, right down to the ground level where there's bins and, dumpsters and mailboxes. And he's just sitting there under the stairs, just watching the feet going up and down, the comings and goings, and he's waiting for an opportunity. He's waiting for a child who is by themselves and who is vulnerable for the taking. And he doesn't have to wait long because suddenly he can hear these quick-footed, light little steps down the metal stairs above him. And it's a 7-year-old girl by herself, and her name is Małgosia. Now, Małgosia survives, so let's just start with the good news. But he jumps out from underneath these stairs, and with one hand he grabs Małgosia, and with the other one he takes out his trusty bayonet and he starts stabbing her. He stabs her a total of 8 times. And I can only imagine this little 7-year-old girl. She has no idea what is going on. She's just heading out to play with her friends, I imagine. And then this complete stranger jumps out from underneath the stairs and just starts stabbing her. And she loses consciousness immediately. And I mean, thank God, like I can't help but wonder if this is part of what saved her life. Like, had she not lost consciousness, would he have continued stabbing her for longer? Because every single stab could have been fatal. She sustained 8 stab wounds. She's a 7-year-old girl. Can you imagine how tiny her little body would have been? And this 19-year-old guy is stabbing her with this gigantic bayonet knife. But she's taken to the hospital. She's found. And like I said, she survives. God knows what kind of path to recovery she had to endure, but she lives. I think that's a miracle, but she lives. And Karol, this piece of shit, do you remember Danusha, his friend, that he kind of jokingly said, I could kill you and make it look like an accident? Yeah, well, like I mentioned earlier, they continued as friends. Like, they maintained their friendship, and they're still, 2 years after that incident, they're still friends. And he goes to Danusha and he tells Danusha everything he's been up to, because he tells his friend everything. And he lets her know that he attacked this girl and, he stabbed her, he waited under the stairs, and he gives her the blow-by-blow of what happened with Małgosia. And he's almost bragging, like he's excited relaying this story to Danusha. Now, I have so many questions about Danusha. She doesn't believe him, okay? So she thinks that he's just making this up to, brag. What planet are you on? Why would somebody just make that up? And if they are just making that up, they're probably a bit disturbed, and why are you friends with them? But anyway, let's get off Danusha, because maybe she had her own issues. We don't know. We're not going to judge Danusha. She's not the monster of this story. But the point is, she doesn't believe him. And then later, she sees in the paper that this whole horrific incident has happened nearby, and this little kid who's 7, she's been stabbed 8 times by a complete stranger, and they don't know who did it. So at this point, alarm bells start to go off for Danusha. Better late than never, girl, but they finally start to go off. And Danusha shares this with her therapist. I mean, you'd think she'd just pick up the phone and call the police, but no, she shares it with her therapist, who says to her, you need to call the police right now. I mean, thank you. Okay, someone is speaking sense. So she does that. She calls the police and she tells them everything that she knows. And they don't swoop in straight away to arrest Karol. They kind of put him under surveillance. So he's due to be sitting his end of year school exams in July. And this is April. So they're getting the information in April that this guy is probably our culprit here. But they choose to hang back and just kind of watch him, keep a very close eye on him, make sure that he's not going to harm anybody else. But if he is our guy, if he has committed these crimes, we are going to let him finish those school exams so that there is no way that he can then say that he is not competent, that he's, mentally unfit to stand trial. We're going to make sure that this is ironclad if this is our guy. Which, I mean, it's controversial, but I can also kind of see where they're coming from on that. If I was Malgosia or Lisec's mother, I don't know how I would feel about them knowing my child's murderer and letting him just live his life for another 3 months. So there's a lot of ways to look at it. But they apprehend him. The minute he finishes those July exams, they apprehend him, they arrest him. And at first he kind of plays the silent game. He's not admitting, but he's not denying. He's just kind of hanging back and trying to stay reserved. And then they bring in the 2 elderly ladies that survived. So do you remember Helen, his first victim, and Francesca, his second victim? So they bring in these 2 ladies in the hopes that they might be able to identify him. And one of them points at him straight away and says, it's him. He's the one. He did this. I remember him. And Karol, with a smile on his face, just looks straight back at her and tells her, if you would like, I can finish the job. So yeah, he's basically now just owning up. The jig is up. I confess it was me. And oh my God, does he confess? He takes the ultimate pleasure in confessing every tiny detail, everything that he was thinking, everything that he did, everything he did during, after, even down to the failed poisonings and the failed arson attempts. He told them things that he had only fantasized about and that never actually acted on. He shared with them the disturbing details about the blood on the knife and how he would lick the blood clean from the knife. He would enjoy the feeling of it on his skin, how he loved to consume the blood of his victims. And it was so unbelievably out there and wackadoo that they needed to bring him to the scenes of these attacks, to every single one of them. And they did a reenactment. So they wanted him to show them exactly how he carried out these crimes. And this is a method to thwart false confessions, attention-loving nutcases who want to take claim over some heinous acts because to them it's glory. So they did take him out to these locations of all of these attacks and they asked him, show me how you did it. And they took video and photo, which is just so disturbing to see him in these photos doing these reenactments. It is so chilling. But lo and behold, his accounts, his reenactments, they were completely consistent with the crime scenes and the victims' accounts. And each time he was reenacting one of these attacks, the police just watched this 19-year-old boy transform in front of their eyes into this absolute monster. And a monster who was really, really enjoying recounting these attacks, like reliving these attacks. Like, it was creepy. They could see on his face how excited he was getting, how flushed his cheeks were getting, how big and bug-eyed he was getting over it. And this continued in the courtroom. Like, he was beaming with pride anytime somebody was up on the stand, talking about one of the attacks. Or Danusha, his friend, she was giving testimony and she was recounting the things that he had told her. He was sitting there just taking it in, smiling, enjoying every minute of it. So to say that he had no remorse, like, that is a bit of an understatement. Like, he has clearly stated that he never planned to stop. He stated that if he was ever given the chance, he would do it again. Like, absolutely not a question. And if he was going to be sentenced to death for what he's done, then it's worth it to him. And he said that it was very strange. He accepted that he was a murderer, but he didn't see himself as evil. He just had this need for blood, and surely satisfying a need that was so deep, it can't be evil. So although he saw, in his words, drunkards and philanderers as evil people, he didn't see himself as an evil person, and murder was just kind of a consequence of him satisfying this deep need for blood. Now, despite how bonkers that sounds, he was, of course, deemed competent to stand trial, and he was found guilty on the 2 counts of murder for Maria and Lisek, and he was also found guilty on 10 counts of attempted murder. So that was for Helen, for Francesca, and for Malgosia, but also he had admitted to all the attempted poisonings and arson attacks, so they included those. And he was, like I said, he was found guilty on all counts, but he was sentenced to death by hanging. And although this was kind of trying to be appealed, none of the appeals stuck, and I'm not really surprised considering that he went on record and said, "I don't regret any of this, and if you ever let me out, I will do this again." So if there was ever something not to say if you were trying to appeal your death sentence, that would probably be it. And his death sentence was carried out. He died by hanging at age 21. Crazy, isn't it? 21, you've done all of that horrible shit and you're only 21. But that was it, guys. That was the case of Karol Kot. So I think I need a cup of coffee after that. I definitely need to go down and watch something happy on the TV. But I'll be back again tomorrow for another installment of Criminal Spud. Until then, have a lovely evening. Lock your doors, set your alarms, and as always, sweet dreams.